She walked through the crowded airport, her bag slung over her shoulder, earbuds in her ears. The familiar hum of travelers and rolling suitcases filled her senses. She glanced at the digital board overhead, scanning the rows of flights her flight was on time. She smiled to herself, thinking of the window seat she always chose and the quiet she could find. Once she was above the clouds, her steps were measured calm as she weaved through the line of people moving toward security. Her mind wandered to the meeting she had later that day, the report she had to finalize, the small details she still needed to check. She barely noticed the sounds around her until the line slowed, a few travelers murmuring in agitation. She shifted her weight, feeling the tap of impatience in her chest. A mother called for her child. A suitcase tumbled and rolled across the floor. A man muttered under his breath about lost time. The cacophony blended into a dull background hum. She adjusted her backpack and checked, her watch noting she still had plenty of time. She exhaled the stress of the week, leaving her chest in a small sigh. She felt normal, safe, ordinary. The security line moved sluggishly. She watched as each passenger approached the X-ray machines and the metal detectors. She observed the focused expressions of the officers, their hands moving swiftly over bins, trays, and suitcases. She noted the subtle tension in their shoulders, the way they paused and glanced around as if they could sense something beyond the ordinary. She felt a small ripple of curiosity at the intensity of the scene. She had passed through countless airports and never noticed these small details. She wondered if today would be any different. She stepped closer to the belt, adjusting her bag. The fluorescent lights reflected off the polished floor, her reflection flickering as people passed behind her. She took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of coffee perfume and the faint tang of jet fuel wafting from the boarding gates beyond. She felt a sense of anticipation that was entirely normal, but her instincts prickled slightly, the hairs on the back of her neck rising for no obvious reason. She shook it off, thinking she was tired. Then she heard it, a sudden sharp thud, the kind of sound that makes people stop mid-step. Her head snapped toward the source near the security checkpoint. She saw a man stumble forward, his body lurching unnaturally. A flash of blue caught her attention. The uniform, unmistakable Navy SEAL. The man clutched at his side, his face pale, his mouth opening in a soundless gasp. He fell to the floor, the impact echoed against the walls. The line of passengers froze, mouths open, eyes wide, some stepping back, others leaning forward instinctively. Unsure of what to do, she felt her own breath catch in her throat. The scene unfolded in slow motion around her. She could see the metallic shine of badges, the crumple of fabric under the man as he hit the floor, the sudden rush of movement as people reacted, security officers running toward him. Voices raised, yet nothing seemed coordinated. She felt rooted to the spot, unsure whether to flee or move forward. She felt the eyes of strangers on her, a mixture of shock, fear, and confusion. She took a cautious step closer, then another, drawn by an instinct she could not explain. She noticed the blood slicking the floor, the sharp red against the pale tiles, and felt a surge of adrenaline that made her hands tingle and her heart pound. She realized immediately that the man needed help, and she could not ignore it. Other passengers whispered and murmured their confusion and fear. Some pulled out phones, dialing emergency numbers. Others simply froze as the reality of the moment settled in the cavernous space of the airport. The SEAL groaned weakly, his hand moving in a futile attempt to steady himself. She crouched beside him, her knees pressing against the cold floor, her mind racing 1,000 thoughts at once. What should I do? What if I make it worse? What if he dies before help arrives? She felt the weight of responsibility press against her chest, heavier than she expected. The rush of people around her became a blur. She could only focus on the figure in front of her, the man who was trained for war, now helpless and vulnerable. She brushed the hair from his forehead, her fingers trembling. She searched for a pulse. her hand hesitating above his chest, not wanting to push too hard or too soft. Her mind cataloged everything she had ever seen in movies, first aid videos, even vague memories from school safety classes. Nothing seemed enough. She felt the heat of the blood seeping through the fabric of his uniform. She inhaled sharply, the smell metallic and sharp. She looked up at the crowd around her and realized she was alone in her focus. The world continued moving around them, oblivious to the fragile thread of life under her hands. She felt the surreal nature of it pressing in like an impossible weight. Then she noticed something unusual on his arm. A tattoo. A faint marking just above his wrist. A symbol that seemed oddly familiar. She squinted at it, trying to place it in her memory. A flicker of recognition sparked deep in her mind. She could not name it. But the feeling was undeniable, a wave of realization that she had seen this symbol before, perhaps in a documentary, perhaps in a news article, perhaps in a story told quietly among friends, but it hit her now with startling clarity that this man was not just any SEAL. He was someone whose story had brushed against her own life in a way she could not yet articulate. Her heart skipped another beat as she realized the weight of the moment that something about this encounter was meant to be, and yet she did not understand why. The noise of the airport seemed distant. She heard shouts and calls, but they were muted almost like she was underwater. Her focus narrowed entirely on the man before her, the metallic scent of blood, the tautness of his face, the shallow, uneven breaths he drew. She could feel the pulse under her fingertips, weak and fluttering, but present enough to make her hope she was not too late. She pressed closer, adjusting her position, trying to keep him stable and warm, and then she felt it, a small squeeze of his hand, a flicker of consciousness, a hint that he was aware of her there in the crowd among strangers, and yet connected to her somehow, and she realized she could not leave him. Not yet. Her mind raced as she searched the line of passengers for someone else, trained, someone who could help anyone. She caught the eyes of a young man in a uniform. She tried to call to him, but the words stuck in her throat. The sound of the crowd seemed to crush them. Before they reached anyone, she glanced at the SEAL again, his face pale and straining, and the symbol on his arm burned in her memory. She had to do something, and then a thought struck her like a lightning bolt, that perhaps she was exactly where she was meant to be. And the unfolding chaos was only the beginning of a story that had chosen her whether she wanted it or not, and she realized the next second could change everything. Her hands shook as she touched his shoulder, trying to gauge. If he could respond, she could feel the warmth of his body slipping, the weak pulse under her fingertips growing more erratic, and her stomach dropped as the thought hit her that she might be too late. And then she heard a faint groan from him, a rasp of air that signaled life still lingered, and she pressed closer, determined not to let him go. Not here. Not now. And the crowd around her seemed to fall away, leaving only her and the man whose life balanced on the edge, and the symbol she could not forget. And she wondered what it meant, and why it mattered so much. And then a sudden rush of movement from security and passengers closing in made her heart pound, and she realized the next moment would demand everything she had. She swallowed, hard, and leaned closer, her breath mingling with the metallic scent of blood and the antiseptic tang of the floor. She looked into his eyes, faint and flickering, and saw something that made her heart skip again. Recognition, or perhaps desperation. She could not tell. And she realized she had to act before it was too late, before the world swallowed him completely. She felt a wave of fear surge, and then resolve. And then she noticed the tight clench of his hand around hers, and the faint flicker of a smile. And she knew somehow this was not random. This was the beginning of something she could not yet understand. And then a commotion to her left drew her eyes, and the world seemed to tilt, and she knew the next second would change everything. The security line erupted into chaos as passengers stepped back and officers rushed toward the fallen SEAL. Her heart pounded in her chest, her hands still pressed against his uniform trying to keep him steady. She could feel the warmth of his blood, seeping through her fingers, and the metallic tang filled her senses. She bent closer, trying to hear his breathing shallow and uneven, but present enough to give a spark of hope around her. People shouted questions and instructions, some dialing for help, others pointing at the floor and the still trembling figure. She felt the tension in the air coil tight like a spring ready to snap. Her mind raced, calculating the moments, ticking by, each second, stretching painfully. She tried to remember every first aid technique she had ever seen, her fingers brushing against the pulse under his wrist, weak but insistent, and then a sudden movement made her jump, as a young security officer knelt beside her, offering a hand. She hesitated for a heartbeat, unsure if he knew what to do, and then she realized it did not matter. She was already committed. She pressed closer, focusing entirely on the man before her, the SEAL whose life now rested on the edge of a knife. She glanced at the tattoo again, the symbol she had recognized in the chaos burning in her mind. It made no logical sense to see it here on a man bleeding and struggling for life. She traced it with her eyes, trying to connect it to the fragmented memories of stories she had heard whispered in the background of documentaries or news reports. She could not place it fully, but the feeling was undeniable. A mixture of recognition and fear, and yet curiosity and resolve surged together. She leaned closer, adjusting her position as the SEAL groaned weakly, one hand clutching her arm. Instinctively, she pressed harder, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. The crowd around them blurred into motionless shadows, her entire focus narrowing to him, to the pulse, to the blood, and the grip of destiny that seemed to tie them together. People were moving around them like ghosts, phones raised to capture the moment, the clatter of shoes and luggage fading into an almost surreal backdrop. She felt the SEAL's eyes flick open just slightly, a shadow of consciousness passing over his expression, and she caught the faintest look of gratitude or recognition before his eyes fluttered closed again. Her hands shook, trying to keep him steady, trying to give him a chance to hold on. A faint thrum of panic rose in her chest. She realized how fragile the moment was, how small the margin between life and death, and yet she could not stop. Now she pressed harder on the wound, her fingers trembling but precise, following instincts that felt older than her years. The security officer beside her tried to speak words of encouragement, but the sounds barely registered. She felt the pull of urgency tighten around her chest. She needed to act faster every second, counting like hours. The SEAL's breathing became more ragged, a shallow rasp echoing against the sterile walls around them. She could feel the warmth of blood slowing beneath her touch, and a sudden thought struck her. What if the bleeding is too much? What if she is too late? And then she remembered the training videos, the techniques, the small details that could save a life. If only she could hold on, and she pressed her hands harder against the wound, willing him to stay alive, willing him to recognize her determination to act. She noticed the faint clench of his jaw, the twitch of his fingers, and the small squeeze of her own hand, a sign that he was aware that she was there, that he was fighting despite the pain and the weakness that threatened to swallow him whole. She felt a surge of hope mixed with fear that left her breathless, the line of passengers around them murmuring and pointing like an indistinct river of movement. She felt entirely isolated, yet connected in a way that defied explanation. The symbol on his arm burned in her memory as if demanding she understand its meaning, and she realized this was more than chance. This was fate intersecting her ordinary life with something extraordinary. The commotion intensified. As paramedics approached, wheeling equipment and shouting orders, the airport seemed to shrink around her, and the man whose life she was holding, she felt the tight grip of his hand and the flutter of his eyes once more, and she realized that the next moment was everything and nothing. At once, a breathless tension pressing in from all sides. Her instincts screamed at her to keep him conscious, to keep him alive, to keep her mind from panicking. She applied pressure to his wound, adjusting the angle of his arm, trying to stabilize the blood flow, every motion precise yet frantic, and then a sudden tug on her sleeve startled her. She looked up to see a bystander offering a first aid kit, her fingers brushing over antiseptic and gauze, and then another officer kneeling beside her attempting to assist, and she realized that help had arrived, but it was still her hands holding life together. She caught snippets of conversation around her. The mention of the SEAL's name, fragments of recognition spreading among those watching, and a low murmur of awe as people realized who lay before them. She leaned closer to his face, her breath hot against his cheek, and whispered words that came unbidden, telling him to stay with her, to hold on a little longer, as if her voice alone could anchor him to life. The shallow rasp of his breathing seemed to falter, then stabilize in slight rhythm, and she felt a shiver of relief mixed with renewed terror, because she knew this fragile balance could collapse at any moment. The tattoo burned in her mind again, and she realized she had to understand the connection. Even as she focused entirely on keeping him alive, she traced the faint lines with her eyes, trying to remember the story, the whispers, the fleeting memory, and then she saw it, something she had not noticed before. A small emblem hidden beneath the edge of the uniform, a mark she recognized immediately, and the recognition sent a jolt through her body, as if she had uncovered a hidden code. And she realized the significance of this moment was far beyond life and death. It was a bridge between worlds, between stories, between strangers bound by fate. The SEAL's fingers twitched again, clutching hers with faint pressure. She felt a pulse of strength returning despite the blood loss. She whispered to him, names she did not know if he could hear them. Words that carried memory and recognition. The world around them faded almost completely, leaving her and the man and the strange symbol that tied them together, and she realized this encounter was transforming her in ways she could not yet understand, her own pulse thundering in her ears, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic blood and adrenaline. She pressed harder, willing him to fight, willing him to survive, willing the moment to stretch just long enough for help to secure his life. A sudden shout from the paramedics drew her attention as they readied stretchers and emergency equipment. She felt a pang of fear that leaving him even for a moment could undo everything, but their careful movements were necessary. Their hands trained and precise, she coordinated with them as best she could, keeping pressure where it was needed, guiding them around the wound. She felt the warmth of his gaze flicker toward her, almost a silent acknowledgement of gratitude or perhaps understanding, and she knew in her bones that this moment was only the beginning of something far larger than either of them could comprehend. She inhaled sharply and pressed closer to stabilize him. Just as the first paramedic leaned over and murmured instructions to her, she felt a wave of exhaustion wash through her limbs, but she did not release her grip. She could not allow herself to falter. The crowd behind them, now buzzing with whispers and cameras, capturing the scene, she felt a strange disconnect from the reality around her, focusing entirely on the fragile thread of life she held and the strange bond forming through pain and recognition. And then the SEAL murmured something low, a sound she could not understand, but that resonated deep in her chest, and she realized that the next move, the next breath could change everything. Her fingers pressed hard on the wound, her hands trembling but resolute. She glanced at the paramedics and security, the line of strangers who had frozen into silent witnesses. She leaned closer to the SEAL, her ear near his mouth, and caught a faint rasp of sound that felt like a message meant for her alone, and she understood instinctively that the story unfolding was far from over, and that the moment she was living would echo far beyond the walls of the airport. The paramedics hovered over the SEAL, her hand still pressing against the wound. She leaned closer to guide them, her voice low and urgent, telling them where to apply pressure, which angle to hold her pulse thrumming in her ears. The chaos of the airport fading into a blur of movement and sound. She felt entirely focused on the man before her, the blue camouflage uniform streaked with blood, the shallow rasp of his breathing, the faint pulse under her fingers that gave her hope and terror. All at once, she felt the pull of destiny tighten around them, like an invisible cord connecting their lives in a way she could not yet comprehend. She caught a glimpse of the tattoo again, the symbol on his arm etched into her memory burning with recognition, and she traced it with her eyes trying to piece together the fragments of a story she had only half remembered, whispers of bravery, of missions, of names spoken in hushed tones that suddenly seemed to converge in this moment. The seal groaned faintly, and she pressed harder, her fingers trembling but precise, willing him to stay alive, willing him to fight, willing the seconds to stretch long enough for her hands and the paramedics to hold the fragile thread of life together. Around them, passengers had formed a rough circle, some recording the scene, others whispering in awe, the tension in the air palpable, as if everyone could feel the balance between life and death, pressing down in the sterile fluorescent light. The rolling suitcases and distant announcements faded into insignificance, leaving only her the seal and the pulse she could feel under her fingertips, a rhythm so weak it seemed like it might vanish at any moment yet, stubbornly persistent enough to ignite hope and desperation. In equal measure, she leaned closer to his face, the warmth of his breath mingling with the metallic scent of blood and her own fear rising like a tide. The paramedics moved swiftly, setting up equipment while she adjusted her position, pressing with one hand and guiding with the other. She felt the sudden squeeze of his fingers around hers, a faint but undeniable sign of consciousness, a small thread connecting them through pain and urgency. She whispered words she did not know if he could hear, telling him to hold on, to fight, to survive. The faint rasp of a sound escaped his lips, and she felt it like a spark of life igniting in her chest. She could not stop now. Not when everything depended on her determination, on the precision of her movements, on the courage she had summoned in a split second. Her mind raced, trying to recall every detail she had ever learned about first aid compressions, pressure points, techniques. She had watched videos, studied briefly in passing. She applied each motion instinctively, aware that any hesitation could cost him his life. The paramedics nodded to her, following her directions. At her silent insistence, she adjusted their hands, guiding them to hold pressure at the correct angle. A faint twitch of the SEAL's hand reassured her that her choices were working, and yet terror coiled in her stomach because the rhythm of his pulse remained erratic, threatening to falter. At any second, the crowd watched silently, as if aware that their lives had intersected with something extraordinary. She traced the tattoo again, the symbol etched into her memory, the emblem under the edge of his uniform, now visible, a mark that connected to stories she had heard, a story of bravery and sacrifice, whispered quietly in documentaries, in news segments and hushed conversations, and now living before her eyes, the reality of it pressed on her chest, heavier than the weight of the world. She leaned closer, feeling the warmth of blood and life mingling with fear and adrenaline. She whispered to him a name she thought she remembered from the stories, and felt a faint squeeze of his hand in response, a tiny acknowledgement that he recognized her, or at least understood her presence. The airport around them blurred into motionless shadows. She could barely hear the announcements, the rolling of suitcases, the chatter of passengers. Everything focused on him, on the rhythm of his pulse, the faint rasp of his breath, the fragile thread that connected them in this impossible moment. She adjusted her hands, pressing harder on the wound, directing the paramedics with precision, her voice calm and firm. Despite the thundering of her own heartbeat, the SEAL groaned again, a sound of pain and struggle, and she felt a surge of determination. She could not let go. She could not allow him to slip away. Not here. Not now. Not when fate had chosen this exact moment to intersect their lives. She felt the subtle twitch of his fingers again, a sign of awareness, a spark of recognition that ignited. Her resolve, she pressed harder, applying pressure in the precise spot she could see under the paramedic's guidance. She adjusted the angle of his arm, holding the torn fabric of his uniform against the wound. She felt the warmth of life under her, touched the thin pulse stubbornly present, and she realized in that instant that she had become more than a bystander. She had become a lifeline, a bridge between chaos and survival, a conduit of courage that she had not known she possessed until now. Around them, the murmurs of passengers grew hushed whispers of recognition, the SEAL's identity spreading in fragments through the crowd, some calling out his name, others snapping pictures of the scene, but she could barely notice them, her focus entirely consumed by him, the shallow rasp of his breathing, the faint flutter of his fingers, the tattoo burning in her memory like a code she had to decipher in real time. The tension coiled tighter every second, a fragile thread of life balanced on the precipice, and she pressed harder, willing him to stay alive, willing him to respond, willing the moment to stretch long enough for the paramedics to secure him safely. Her mind flickered with fragments of memories, a story she had only heard in pieces, a name whispered in documentaries, a hero remembered for deeds she could barely imagine now alive before her. Her hands pressed harder on the wound, feeling the stubborn persistence of life against the weight of blood loss and chaos. She guided the paramedics step by step, holding their hands steady, showing them exactly what needed to be done. The SEAL groaned again, faintly moving his head slightly toward her presence, and she felt a surge of hope mixed with terror that left her breathless. And shaking, she could not falter. Not now, not when everything depended on her instincts and courage. The tattoo and the emblem seemed to pulse in her mind, a beacon of connection and understanding. She leaned closer to the SEAL's face, whispering words. She did not know if he could hear, but that felt necessary. Words of courage, of recognition, of survival, and she felt the faintest twitch of his lips, the flutter of his eyelids, a sign that her efforts were working, that life was stubbornly clinging to him despite the odds, and she pressed harder, unwilling to let go, unwilling to allow this fragile moment to collapse. The crowd watched in silent awe, the airport fading into insignificance, the hum of life outside a distant memory, the only reality, the pulse and the breath and the connection forming between them. A sudden tug on her sleeve made her glance up, a young officer gesturing toward a first aid kit. She took it immediately, rummaging through gauze and antiseptic, quickly returning to his side, her hands moving instinctively, directing the paramedics. She could feel the faint grip of his hand around hers. A spark of life, she pressed harder, adjusting his position, ensuring the blood flow slowed the shallow rasp of his breathing. Beginning to stabilize just enough to ignite hope, the tattoo and emblem etched in her mind, a symbol of destiny intersecting with chance. She whispered to him again a name and felt a faint acknowledgement, a small connection, but enough to make her heart pound in recognition that she had succeeded in keeping him alive just long enough for real help to take over. She leaned closer, pressing harder, adjusting the wound and guiding the paramedics, each movement precise, every second stretching the fragile thread of life. And she realized that the story unfolding was larger than any single person. The SEAL whose life she held now, intertwined with her own fate and destiny, a silent acknowledgement in his fluttering eyes, telling her that this encounter was only the beginning and that what happened next could change everything. The SEAL's breathing steadied slightly under her hands. She felt the faint warmth of life returning and the flutter of his fingers gripping hers like a silent promise. The chaos of the airport continued around them, the rolling suitcases and murmurs of passengers fading into a blur. She leaned closer, her forehead nearly touching his, as if proximity could anchor him to survival. She whispered words low and steady, urging him to hold on, to fight, to stay awake. And then she noticed the subtle shift in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, a momentary spark that made her heart skip, and she realized that he knew her presence, that he understood more than she could articulate. Her gaze fell again on the tattoo, the symbol etched into his arm, a connection she had sensed from the first instant, now impossible to ignore. It was a mark of honor, of history, of a story that had brushed past her life in fragments until now it burned brightly in her memory. She traced it with her eyes, and a surge of understanding passed through her, as if the pieces of a puzzle were snapping into place. She could feel the gravity of the moment pressing down, and yet she could not. Pull away the seals, hand tightened faintly around hers, and she felt the pulse under her fingers steadying like a heartbeat of fate itself. Paramedics prepared to lift him onto the stretcher, and she moved with them, guiding their hands, adjusting. The pressure keeping him conscious, every movement precise and calculated. She felt a strange connection forming a bond. Neither of them fully understood, yet undeniable. In its intensity, the seal's eyes flickered toward her, a murmur escaping his lips. A sound she could not understand, but that resonated deep in her chest. A word, perhaps a name, perhaps a signal of recognition, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. She realized in that instant that this encounter was not random, that something larger had drawn her here, that life had intersected with destiny in a way she could not yet comprehend. As the paramedic secured him onto the stretcher, she pressed her hand lightly against his arm, one last silent promise that she would be there, and that she would not forget the connection forged in blood and fear. The airport around them fading back into motion, the hum of life returning. But she knew everything had changed, and that this was only the beginning of a story that would haunt and guide her forever. The seal was lifted onto the stretcher, paramedics moving quickly but carefully. She pressed a final hand to his arm, feeling the warmth fading from her fingers into theirs, the hum of the airport returning around her footsteps, and voices blending into normalcy, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. She stood frozen for a moment, watching the stretcher move away, a knot of adrenaline and fear still tight in her chest, the flutter of his hand around hers lingering like a ghost of connection she could not forget. Passengers whispered, glancing at her as if she carried the story of what had just occurred, a sense of awe and curiosity washing over them. Yet she barely noticed their stares, her mind replaying every detail, shallow breaths, the pulse she had felt, the symbol etched into his skin, the spark of recognition she had glimpsed in his eyes, and she knew that she had been part of something larger than herself, something that had chosen her for a moment, that would echo in her life forever. She walked slowly toward her gate. Each step measured her thoughts, tangled between fear, relief, and wonder. The ordinary world continuing around her, yet she felt the weight of the extraordinary pressing in her chest. She realized that nothing would ever feel quite normal again, that the encounter had changed her perspective on courage, on connection, on the fragility and strength of life. Her hand brushed against the edge of her bag, the sound of the rolling suitcase echoing softly. She took a deep breath and felt the pulse of destiny linger in her veins, a silent promise that this was only the beginning, and that the story of the seal and the woman who had held him in her hands would continue to shape her life in ways she could not yet imagine.